June 12, 1944, Normandy, France. Sergeant Thomas Beckett pressed his boot against the accelerator of his Loyd Carrier as German 88 Normandy shells screamed overhead. The small tracked vehicle shuddered, its Ford V8 engine protesting with a mechanical groan that sounded almost human. Behind him, strapped to the carrier's towing hitch, a 6-pounder anti-tank gun bounced violently across the cratered field. The rain had turned the Norman soil into a quagmire that swallowed trucks whole and reduced half-tracks to immobile monuments. But the Loyd kept moving. Its tracks bit into the mud with stubborn determination, pulling 2 tons of artillery through conditions that would have stopped anything twice its size. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of Britain's unsung hero, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether it's London, Sydney, or somewhere in between. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back to life, one vehicle at a time. Beckett's hands ached from gripping the steering levers. The carrier had no roof, no doors, just a rectangular steel box that offered about as much protection as a garden shed. Shrapnel pinged off the thin armor plates. His uniform was soaked through. And yet, as he glanced back at the gun trailing faithfully behind, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude. This ungainly, uncomfortable, utterly unremarkable machine had become the only thing standing between his artillery unit and complete immobility. Then the engine coughed. Once, twice. The track slowed. In that moment, as Beckett's heart hammered against his ribs and German positions loomed 300 yards ahead, he understood something the generals back in London had figured out years earlier. Britain wasn't going to win this war with glamorous weapons. It was going to win with machines stubborn enough to refuse defeat. The story of how Britain reached that realization began 5 years earlier, in a very different kind of mud. In September 1939, the British Expeditionary Force arrived in France carrying an army designed for the last war. Horse-drawn artillery trains still outnumbered motorized transport. Supply columns moved at the pace of a tired mare. The vaunted British armor existed in embarrassingly small numbers, fewer than 300 tanks across the entire expeditionary force. What Britain possessed in tactical doctrine, it lacked in practical mobility. An army cannot fight if it cannot move. And for the first 8 months of the war, Britain's army moved like an arthritic giant, one painful step at a time. The problem wasn't firepower. British guns could strike targets at ranges German infantry couldn't dream of reaching. The problem was getting those guns into position before the enemy moved. In the fluid, mechanized warfare of 1940, static defense became a death sentence. The Wehrmacht proved that during the fall of France, when their panzer divisions bypassed British strongpoints with surgical precision, British commanders watched helplessly as their heavy weapons sat silent, unable to redeploy fast enough to matter. Captain Vivian Loyd had been thinking about this problem since the 1920s. An engineer with an obsessive focus on tracked vehicle design, Loyd had spent 2 decades building small, fast carriers in his workshop. His earlier Carden-Loyd designs had influenced military thinking worldwide. The Soviets copied them, the Japanese studied them, even the Americans took notes. But those early vehicles were experiments, curiosities for a peacetime army that didn't yet understand the word logistics. When war came, Loyd's curiosity became Britain's necessity. The War Office issued its requirements in early 1940 with bureaucratic brevity. Develop a light-tracked vehicle capable of towing artillery, transporting supplies, and operating across any terrain. It must use existing automotive components. It must be cheap enough to produce by the thousands. And it must be ready within months, not years. These weren't ambitious specifications. They were desperate ones. Britain needed a mechanical mule, and it needed it yesterday. Loyd's design answered every requirement with brutal simplicity. A rectangular steel frame. 2 continuous tracks powered by a Ford V8 engine. An open crew compartment with room for a driver, commander, and whatever cargo needed hauling. No turret, no heavy armor, no pretense of being anything other than a workhorse. The vehicle measured just over 12 feet long and weighed 3 tons unladen. By tank standards, it was a toy. By engineering standards, it was perfect. The prototype ran its first trials in March 1940 on a muddy field in Bedfordshire. Engineers watched as the carrier clawed across terrain that stopped conventional vehicles cold. The Ford engine, normally found in civilian trucks, hummed with unexpected reliability. The track system, adapted from earlier Loyd designs, distributed weight efficiently enough to prevent the carrier from sinking. One observer noted that it handled like a bathtub on caterpillars. Not a compliment, but not a condemnation either. It worked. In wartime, that was enough. Production authorization came through in May 1940, just as France collapsed and Dunkirk became a name that would haunt British consciousness for decades. The Ministry of Supply contracted with multiple manufacturers, Wolseley Motors, Ford, and later the Aveling Barford Company. Each factory received the same blueprints, the same specifications, the same urgent deadline: build as many as possible, as fast as possible. The Loyd Carrier wasn't being built to last. It was being built to survive. By autumn 1940, the first production models rolled off assembly lines at a rate that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Britain, under siege from the Luftwaffe and threatened with invasion, had transformed itself into a manufacturing fortress. The factories didn't just build carriers, they built hope measured in rivets and welds. Private James Whitmore saw his first Loyd Carrier in November 1940 at a training depot in Hampshire. His initial reaction was disappointment. He'd volunteered expecting to crew a tank, something with armor and guns and the promise of glory. Instead, he got assigned to a vehicle that looked like someone had welded a tool shed to a tractor. The Loyd had no doors, no roof. The seats were bare metal that froze in winter and scorched in summer. The engine noise made conversation impossible at anything above a shout. But over the following weeks, as Whitmore learned to drive the carrier across the muddy fields of southern England, his opinion shifted. The Loyd possessed a quality that transcended comfort: reliability. It started in weather that made other vehicles sulk. Its tracks gripped terrain where wheels spun uselessly. When something broke, and things always broke, the repair was often simple enough to complete with a wrench and determination. The carrier asked nothing of its crew except persistence. In return, it delivered the same. Training emphasized versatility. The Loyd could tow a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, a 25-pounder field gun, or a 2-pounder anti-tank gun with equal indifference. Its rear compartment could carry ammunition crates, signal equipment, stretchers, or rations. One instructor demonstrated its capacity by loading 15 men into and onto the carrier, a desperate measure for desperate times. The machine groaned but didn't fail. Whitmore began to understand. This wasn't a weapon. It was a lifeline. The Loyd entered combat service in North Africa in 1941, where its capabilities faced their first real test. The desert was a mechanized nightmare: sand-jammed engines, heat-warped components, and distances stretched supply lines to breaking point. British forces in Egypt needed vehicles that could cross the western desert without constant maintenance. The Loyd, with its simple design and accessible engine, proved remarkably desert-worthy. Crews learned to wrap cloth around air intakes to filter sand. They carried extra engine oil and learned to perform field repairs under conditions that would make a peacetime mechanic weep. In the rocky terrain of Tunisia, the carrier demonstrated another virtue: it was small enough to hide. While German armor dominated open ground, Loyd carriers could dart between cover, repositioning anti-tank guns before enemy spotters acquired targets. The tactic saved countless British positions. One after-action report noted that a single carrier-towed 6-pounder destroyed 3 German Mark IVs in 15 minutes by engaging, displacing, and engaging again from a new position. The gun crew survived. The carrier survived. That was victory by a different measure. But it was in the mud of northwestern Europe that the Loyd truly earned its reputation. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the Norman bocage became an infantry nightmare. Ancient hedgerows divided the landscape into a maze of small fields where tanks struggled and trucks bogged down. The Loyd, with its narrow profile and tracked mobility, could navigate paths that existed only in theory. It became the connective tissue of the British advance: unglamorous, invisible, essential. By late 1944, over 26,000 Loyd carriers had been produced. They served with British forces across 4 continents. They hauled supplies through Italian mountains and Burmese jungles. They laid communication cables under fire and evacuated wounded from positions no ambulance could reach. And they did it with mechanical patience that bordered on stubbornness. The real test came during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. British airborne forces, dropped behind German lines in the Netherlands, faced catastrophic supply shortages. Ground forces racing to relieve them encountered fierce resistance. In the chaos, Loyd Carriers became critical supply runners. They shuttled ammunition and medical supplies forward under constant fire, too small to be priority targets, too determined to stop. One carrier crew completed 11 supply runs in 2 days, their vehicle peppered with bullet holes but still mobile. When asked why they kept going, the driver simply said, "Because it still started." That pragmatic courage defined the Loyd service. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. There were no medals for driving a carrier, no glory in towing guns. But every infantryman who received ammunition, every gun crew that stayed supplied, every wounded soldier evacuated from the front, they owed their survival to machines and men that refused to quit. The carrier wasn't winning the war. It was making victory possible. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hastings, commanding an artillery regiment in Belgium, wrote in his diary about the Loyd, "We ask of it the impossible and receive the merely difficult. It complains with every gear change, protests with every kilometer, yet reaches the destination regardless. If Britain could bottle such determination, we'd have won this war in 1940. That entry, dated October 18, 1944, captured what statistics couldn't. The Loyd had become more than a vehicle. It was a philosophy on tracks. The carrier's mechanical simplicity saved it from the fate of more complex vehicles. German Panthers and Tigers possessed superior firepower, but required specialized maintenance and rare parts. When a Tiger broke down, it often stayed broken. When a Loyd stopped, a crew could usually fix it with tools carried aboard. The Ford V8 engine, criticized by some as underpowered, proved remarkably forgiving. It ran on low-grade fuel. It tolerated abuse. It kept running. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, the Loyd Carriers bore the scars of 2 years' hard service. Paint had long since worn away, replaced by rust and field repairs. Tracks were mismatched from battlefield replacements. Engines rattled with sounds that would horrify peacetime mechanics, but they moved. Through the ruins of the Rhineland, across the mud of the North German plain, the carriers followed the tanks and supplied the infantry. They'd become invisible, noticed only in their absence. The Germans, for their part, captured several Loyd carriers and put them to use with grudging respect. One Wehrmacht report described the carrier as primitive aber wirksam, primitive but effective. That assessment, coming from an army that prized engineering excellence, was perhaps the highest compliment possible. The British had built a machine so simple, it transcended critique. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent. And suddenly, Britain faced the question of what to do with thousands of vehicles built for war but still capable of service. The Loyd Carriers, scattered across a liberated continent, faced uncertain futures. Some were sold to Allied nations rebuilding their militaries. Others were converted to civilian use. Farmers in France and Belgium discovered the carrier made an excellent agricultural tractor. Many were simply abandoned, left to rust in depot yards from Belgium to Burma. But the carrier's real legacy wasn't measured in surplus vehicles. It was measured in doctrine. The lessons learned from the Loyd's service reshaped how militaries thought about logistics. British post-war planning emphasized universal mobility, the idea that every unit, regardless of role, needed organic transport. That concept, proven by the Loyd, became foundational to modern military theory. The carrier taught armies that supply lines were as important as front lines. In 1947, Vivian Loyd received recognition for his contribution to the war effort. Though the accolades came quietly, without public ceremony, he'd designed dozens of vehicles over his career, but the carrier that bore his name became his lasting achievement. Not because it was sophisticated, because it was honest. It solved real problems with simple solutions. That, Loyd believed, was engineering's highest calling. Decades passed. The Loyd Carriers that survived were restored by military vehicle enthusiasts who appreciated the machine's utilitarian elegance. Museums acquired examples for their collections. Veterans, grown old, would sometimes pause before a preserved carrier and remember the sound of its engine, the feel of its steering levers, the way it smelled after hours of operation. Hot oil and exhaust and determination. In 2024, fewer than 200 Loyd Carriers remain in various states of preservation. Some still run, clattered across showgrounds at military vehicle rallies, their tracks churning grass as they once churned mud. Each working carrier is a mechanical time capsule, a reminder that history isn't just made by great leaders and decisive battles. Sometimes it's made by small machines that simply refuse to stop. The deeper truth about the Loyd Carrier lies in what it represented beyond its tactical role. Britain in 1940 faced an existential threat with limited resources. The nation couldn't outproduce Germany in steel or explosives. It couldn't field more soldiers or build more tanks than the Wehrmacht. But it could outthink the problem. The Loyd embodied that British pragmatism, the ability to see a problem clearly and solve it with what's available rather than what's ideal. Contrast this with German engineering philosophy. German vehicles were often masterpieces of design, sophisticated, powerful, intimidating. The Tiger tank inspired terror on the battlefield, but it required constant maintenance, rare replacement parts, and specialized tools. When supply lines broke down, Tigers became monuments. The Loyd, conversely, was designed to be maintained by ordinary soldiers with ordinary tools. It wasn't impressive. It was accessible. And in war, accessibility mattered more than sophistication. The carrier's success also revealed something uncomfortable about military glory. The weapons that win wars aren't always the ones that receive credit. Spitfires saved Britain during the Battle of Britain and earned eternal fame. Sherman tanks are synonymous with Allied victory. But ask a veteran of the Northwest Europe campaign what vehicle he trusted most, and the answer often surprises. The unglamorous carrier that brought supplies when roads disappeared and trucks failed. Sergeant Thomas Becket, who'd driven a Loyd through Normandy, survived the war and returned to civilian life as a bus driver in Manchester. In 1983, interviewed for a local history project, he described his wartime vehicle. "It was the most uncomfortable, noisy, cold, miserable machine I ever operated. It leaked when it rained, baked when the sun came out, and complained every minute it ran. But it got me through the war alive, and it got my mates their ammunition when they needed it. I'd trust it over any fancy tank the generals loved." That testimonial, modest and unglamorous, captured the carrier's essence better than any technical specification. The Loyd wasn't loved, it was trusted. And trust, in wartime, was worth more than affection. Modern military planners studying the Loyd Carrier encounter lessons that remain relevant 80 years later. The principle of good enough engineering, building systems that prioritize reliability over sophistication, has become foundational to military logistics. The United States military's HMMWV, the British Army's Supercat vehicles, even modern unmanned supply vehicles all trace conceptual lineage back to the Loyd's philosophy. Build it simple, build it tough, build it fixable. The carrier also demonstrated the importance of modularity. By designing a platform that could serve multiple roles, Britain maximized its limited industrial capacity. One production line, dozens of applications. That thinking influences modern military procurement, where multi-role vehicles reduce logistical complexity and cost. The Loyd was perhaps the first truly modular military vehicle, not by design ambition, but by wartime necessity. Yet the carrier's story also contains warnings. The pressure to produce quickly sometimes resulted in quality issues. Some early models suffered from weak suspension components or poorly welded frames. Crews learned which factories built reliable carriers and which produced vehicles that needed immediate modification. The lesson: speed cannot completely replace quality, even in war. The Loyd succeeded because its fundamental design was sound. Had the core engineering been flawed, no amount of production volume would have saved it. Historical debates focus on grand strategy: when to invade France, where to allocate bombers. But those decisions only mattered if armies could move. The Loyd Carrier was the foundation beneath grand plans. Britain produced over 26,000 carriers. Germany built 1,300 Tigers. Yet historians argue endlessly about Tigers while barely mentioning carriers. History privileges the dramatic over the essential. Today you might find a Loyd Carrier tucked in a museum corner, overshadowed by grander machines. But numbers can't capture what it meant to the men who relied on it. The carrier didn't win the war in one dramatic moment. It won through 10,000 small ones. Deliveries made, guns positioned, wounded evacuated.